Now, this is our last lecture for this semester. We originally thought about having another one on December the 5th. And then I look at the calendar, of course, the day after is Army Navy Day, so and nobody will be interested in anything about Asia by that time, for good reason. Now, when you talk about China, there are a lot of, we face a lot of challenges: military, economy, politics. One of the often neglected, but also one of the paramount concern, not only to China but also to us, is this environment. Anybody who's been to China will have this immediate and palpable sense of this, the degree of concern about the environment. There are very few Westerners who study the environment has reached the level of sophistication and comprehensiveness as our speaker. Judy Shapiro is a long-time China watcher. Is so old-fashioned name, but when I came to this country in 1985, one of the first names I learned is Judy Shapiro, because she was running also very influential and very good publications, popular articles over here. And many of you who took my course, you read her book, Mao's War Against Nature, which is one of the very important books in this genre. So, but now Dr. Shapiro is the director of the environmental program at the American University. And it's not just about China, but also place China on the global perspective. And she also, on the way here, she told me that she also runs some program in Costa Rica, for example. So, and we're fortunate to have her over here to give us a talk. And if you want to pursue this topic more, you are welcome to contact Dr. Shapiro afterwards. So without further ado, I present you Dr. Judy Shapiro.
Well, thank you, Dr. Yimao Chuan. Doctor, you wrote a review of my book, so I'm really grateful to him for helping me. Well, for me to be here today is a great opportunity. I do know there's a funeral. I read about the passing of your, what do you call it, bleep? You call it bleep? So that's really sad, and so I hope that we can remember him even though we're here. And I guess it's a good memory to know that life is just very fragile. So I appreciate every moment that we're here. So for me to be here is different. I don't usually come out to the U.S. Navy Academy, so it's a beautiful place. You all look great, and I tell people I hope they wear their outfits. That's really great. Okay, I'll tell you what I'm going to do today. I'll be talking for about half an hour, and then we'll be dialoguing for another half an hour. And what I'm going to try to do is give you a little bit of personal perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about the severity of China's problems, although I suspect most of us already have a sense of that. I'm going to try to give a little historical context for those problems. I'm going to talk about these problems as having important security ramifications and transboundary impacts. And then finally I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can and cannot do about the problems. I've actually lately been teaching a course called Environmental Security in Asia. And as a result of teaching that course, we've been going through all of this literature about security, how to define security, what security is. I'm sure you all get that, right, in your classes? How many do you get? I mean, we have this global security, national security, human security argument. Are you all pretty familiar with that? And I would guess I like to make the case today that China's environmental problems really are security issues. And whether you're talking about them on the global scale, where we're talking about the global infrastructure of the entire planet, climate change and then depletion, and those sorts of issues, then China is a major factor. But if we're talking about national security, I'll give you some examples in a bit about how China's relationship with its neighbors often comes to a head over resource conflicts. Also, the Chinese state itself, we could say, from a national security perspective for the Chinese government, is in some ways endangered by the catastrophic level of environmental degradation. The level of discontent in the country because of environmental problems is very, very high. And finally, on the human security level, it's fine that the Chinese consumer can now have a refrigerator and a car, but it's not really much good if you're also dying of cancer. So that's kind of the way I see the security side. But first, a little perspective. When I first taught in Hunan province in 1979, I was considered a distinguished foreign expert, so-called, because I was the first foreigner. And so they gave me an air conditioner. And every time I turned on the air conditioner, which was exactly twice, all of the electricity in the whole university went out. And the only way to stay warm in the winter was with these coal bricks that were called lotus bricks. You mix the coal up with sand, and in order to use them, you had to leave all the windows open because there was a lot of carbon monoxide coming out of burning that stuff. The whole university had exactly 5 cars, tens of thousands of students and teachers, but only 5 cars. And in order to be able to ride in one of these cars, you had to be one of the party leaders who was running the university, actually all retired military people who had had only a 3rd grade education, if that, and holdovers from the Cultural Revolution. And you could identify these people not only by their army uniforms, but also by the size of their stomachs, which was very large because they got to eat a lot of banquets and ride in these small cars. Well, what a difference, a decade or 2 makes. Now, Changsha, where I was, is home to dozens of Fortune 500 companies, including Coca-Cola, Philips, Mitsubishi, and they have no fear that they're going to have blackouts, and the number of vehicles in the city is more than 500,000, with about 40% privately owned. Pretty much everyone is either has already learned to drive or is learning how. And of course, Changsha, which is an interior, central south city, is just a tiny example of what's going on a much more dramatic scale in the rest of the country. Shanghai, Beijing, for example. So, China has become the world's manufacturing hub. But becoming the world's manufacturing hub comes at an enormous the country's air, water, soil, grasslands, and wetlands are under assault from rapid urbanization and industrialization. And yet nowadays, the Chinese don't need foreigners to tell them how bad the situation is. The strongest critics are coming from inside the country. There's a very famous environmentalist, a senior vice chair of SIPA, which is their equivalent of the EPA. His name is Pan Yue, P-A-N-Y-U-E. And I'll give you some statistics that come from him. He says that the GDP may be growing 8 to 12% a year, but environmental damage is costing the country 8 to 13% of that, effectively wiping out the growth. Since 1949, the population has doubled, but arable land has decreased by 1/3 due to erosion and urbanization. Environmentally induced social unrest, this is a really amazing figure, is rising quickly. And in 2005, there were literally 51,000 cases of environmental unrest. Huge number. And that number is supposed to be increasing 30% every year. 40% of China's waterways are heavily polluted. One-third of Chinese cities have serious air pollution problems. 30 million farmers don't have access to clean water. 400 million urban residents cannot breathe clean air. We'll talk about some of these problems just briefly. More about air pollution. 56% of the country's cities have been affected by acid rain. And in the lead up to the Olympics, which was China's big coming out party, the World Bank calculated that there were 750,000 unnatural deaths every year due to air pollution. And yet the Chinese government suppressed that figure because it was considered too scary and upsetting figure. As far as water is concerned, the water table in North China has been dropping. A lot of competition for the Yellow River waters, and sometimes the Yellow River, which is one of China's 2 great rivers, as I think all of you know, doesn't always flow all the way to the sea. So there's a real possibility in the near future that the residents of Beijing will not have water to drink, which would lead to a flow of environmental refugees that's just huge. So I hope you all know this phrase, environmental refugees, is a really useful and important phrase that I think we're going to be seeing more and more of in the coming years. Now, to deal with that, the Chinese government is doing something called the South-North Water Transfer Scheme. How many of you have already heard of that? South-North Water Transfer Scheme. The idea is that there is a mega project that's actually greater in sort of environmental impact and cost than the Three Gorges Dam. The idea is that they're going to build 3 channels from the Yangtze River, which has lots of water, to the Yellow River, which has not enough water. And those 3 channels would be in the middle reaches, which is the one they're already building, and the lower reaches, where they're going to kind of dig out the old Grand Canal that used to be around. And then the scariest one is up in the headlands in the Tibetan area, which would be environmentally devastating for these very fragile ecosystems, but also very hard to do, so they may not go forward with that. But there's a notion that somehow they can build their way or engineer their way out of the problem. So I think we all know it's bad. Okay, so let's just take as a given. What do you call it in the law? Let's stipulate it's bad. Okay, and then we'll move on. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the political roots of the problem. And I don't know how many of you actually read my book, but I brought a copy and I'll circulate it around. So you can just pass it through the ranks here. But my book, Mao's War Against Nature, looked at the relationship between the suffering of people and the suffering of nature during the Mao period. And I'm not going to go into it in enormous detail here, except to argue that during the Mao period, political repression caused the country to lose some of its smartest voices who were speaking out against the damaging big dams that were going to silt up, who were speaking out against the exploding population that was already starting to threaten the country's future. So that kind of political repression, I would argue, is still very much at work in China today. So if you get somebody who's criticizing the South-North Water Transfer Scheme or the Three Gorges Dam, or perhaps is just talking about the real reason that Lake Tai is so polluted, those people can still end up in jail for a very, very long time, even though sometimes a person speaking out like that could lead the country to pay attention to it. Then what do they say? They kill the chicken to scare the monkeys. And so they would punish somebody like that for speaking out, but then maybe do something to fix the problem. During the Mao period, we also saw massive forcible relocations. Young people were forced to, quote-unquote, volunteer to go to the frontier areas, to conquer nature, prepare for war against the Soviet Union and the United States, Soviet Union, the Soviet border, and the U.S. along the Vietnamese border during the Vietnam War. And they were also set to try to kind of remold their own thoughts. So this was a three-pronged kind of effort that if you read the slogans in that period, it's all about, prepare for war, prepare for famine, for the sake of the people. These slogans. Does anybody speak Chinese here aside from Professor Wu, Professor Yu? Yeah.
Quite a few.
Okay. 备战备荒为人民. Okay. So while these people were preparing for war, they were also cutting down the rainforest, planting rubber where the scientists said no rubber could grow, and lo and behold, just destroying all this great habitat for animals, and also not growing rubber. In the north, near the Russian border, they were filling in wetlands, which also happened to be the places where the Siberian crane nest. So they were doing a lot of environmental destruction as they were preparing for war. And interestingly, some of China's great environmentalists nowadays were precisely these so-called educated youths who were forced to volunteer to go to the frontier areas to prepare for war. And they realized that they had essentially sinned against nature. Those of you who've read Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, anybody? This is, if you've read Has anybody read the Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac? Okay, this is your homework. Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac was published in 1949, and it's considered the environmentalist's Bible, essentially, because it's a very, very great literary work, in some ways patterned around the 12 seasons of Thoreau's Walden, but it also articulates a land ethic. And this is sort of an aside, but in the middle section, he talks a lot about how when he was young and working for the Forest Service, he didn't understand the role of big predators in the ecosystem. And his most famous chapter is called Thinking Like a Mountain, in which he describes how, as a young man, he shot a wolf and thought it was a great thing. And then the famous phrase from that chapter is called a fierce green fire. And he talks about watching the fierce green fire of life in the wolf's eyes dying, and understanding in that moment of sort of epiphany that he had committed a great sin. Because when you think like a mountain, you don't want all those deer to proliferate, and denude the mountain of vegetation. So in a way, okay, so bringing back to these Chinese people who went off to the frontier areas, they began to realize that in the name of preparing for war, they had committed a great sin against the earth by cutting down these rainforests and filling in these wetlands. So another sort of core element that is still very much at work in China today is this feeling of urgency. And those of you who read the book know that during the Great Leap Forward, there was a great rush to try to catch up with Britain in steel output. And so there was so much attention to smelting down, just random pieces of steel just so you could measure your melted steel against Russia's output, that they failed to take in the harvest. And there was a so-called 3 hard years, a great famine, in which some 30 million extra deaths occurred in the time between, say, 69 and 71. So that's considered to be the greatest human-created famine in history. And that comes out of this urgency. And so when you see what's going on in China today, there's this urgency, an urgency to get rich, an urgency to grab the land while you can, a kind of a destruction of old neighborhoods that that is just way too fast, because if you modify nature slowly enough, nature will catch up and adapt. But if you come through and crash through things, which is essentially what the Chinese government is doing now, then there's going to be no chance to recover. And you go back past the threshold. In environmental issue studies, we talk about thresholds all the time. And the Chinese will say, oh, we're just doing what you did. And the earth is saying, but if you all do what we did, the earth can't take it, because we're going to go over a threshold, and we're not going to be able to get there. So, okay. Any questions so far? All right, I'm going to move to transboundary implications and give you some examples. Another key phrase in environmental issues is what we call the displacement of environmental harms. It's a very useful phrase to me, displacement of environmental harms. So as China tries to deal with its environmental issues, it ends up displacing its harms onto other countries. For example, in 1998, there was an enormous flood on the upper reaches of the Yangtze, and so the Chinese understood that excess logging of the upper reaches had caused a lot of erosion, which meant that the floods were a lot worse. So they banned logging in the upper reaches of the Yangtze. That didn't mean that logging went down overall, though. And the amount of deforestation in Burma and Cambodia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, went way up. So they displaced their harm elsewhere. Similarly, when we recycle our computers and we think, oh, this is good, I'm being a good person, I'm recycling my computer. How many of you saw that 60 Minutes show the other week? Yeah. Only your professor, so it's up to you. We think we're being good, but actually sometimes that goes right out the back door and it gets sent over to China, where little children who are barefoot sit in piles of really toxic materials, or little old ladies sit there and try to separate out the copper and the zinc or whatever, and this stuff is highly, highly toxic. So we're displacing our environmental harms onto China. Let me talk a little bit also about fossil fuels and how China's thirst to guarantee some energy security has led it to prop up some really unsavory regimes throughout the world. It's said that the conflict in Sudan is the first climate change-induced conflict that we know about for sure, because basically the drought in the outside of the cities has led nomadic people to move into the cities, which has led to conflict over resources inside the cities. Well, China is propping up the regime in Darfur in order to guarantee a supply of oil. Similarly, China is very close to Iran because it needs Iranian oil, and China has also been very close to Venezuela. So we can see that China's thirst for fossil fuels are definitely causing some tensions globally. Also, competition with old enemies like Japan has gotten very fierce once again, particularly for the natural gas coming out of Kazakhstan, the stands in general. There was a big competition between China and Japan for who would get the head of the pipeline coming out of Kazakhstan, and actually Japan won in that case. And the Japanese, I just came back from a conference in Japan, and the Japanese and Chinese still really don't like each other. It's just, you know, it really hasn't healed. So that's just kind of waiting to jump up. Same thing, China's supply of minerals is dropping, and the competition for minerals is likely to become very fierce. Let's talk a little bit about climate change now, and just mention that China's per capita CO2 emissions is still really low compared with that of the United States. Even though China's CO2 emissions have actually passed over, and China is now the largest emitter of CO2, but on a per capita basis is about 1/5 of U.S. emissions. So the Chinese naturally will say, you know how Bush was saying we can't have a Kyoto Protocol as long as China and Japan don't participate. But I don't know how you all feel about this, but it seems to me that China has a very good ethical argument to make, which is that they're still using what we call survival emissions, whereas we in the developed countries are using what's called luxury emissions. And until we reduce our per capita emissions by getting reasonable CAFE standards, do you know all this kind of stuff? CAFE standards? Who doesn't know what a CAFE standard is? CAFE standard is not getting better coffee at a cafe. It is corporate average fuel efficiency standards, which is the way the government regulates the miles per gallon in our fleets. And essentially, our CAFE standards are much less stringent than China's standards. And what happened was that the automobile makers didn't realize that so many people would be using SUVs as personal vehicles, and those are regulated differently. And as a result, we have really a disgraceful fuel efficiency average for fleets. So we have the power, to get a better CAFE standard. But until we do that, the Chinese are going to say, we're just trying to go through the Industrial Revolution the same way you did. We're just trying to have the same high standard of living that you did. We're just trying to settle the West in the same way that you did. And the funny thing is, we could, if you read Cadillac Desert, have you ever read Cadillac Desert? No? You guys don't do environmental stuff that much, I guess. It's really amazing.
That's why you were here.
Yeah, no, that environmental stuff, there's so many great books. I'm going to send your professor a list of my favorite environmental books.
That'd be great.
Yeah. Cadillac Desert is a really famous book. It's essentially about the history of the American West. And after you get done reading it, you realize that Los Angeles should never have been put there. It makes no sense to have Los Angeles there. And they had to divert all kinds of rivers in order to put Los Angeles there. And then there's all kinds of, there were actually water wars in the West between the farmers and the people of Los Angeles that are still kind of at a low level. I mean, they're not blowing up dams anymore the way they were for a while. But there's enormous tension between the upriver and the downriver uses of water right here in this country. So anyway, you try to tell the Chinese, well, we should never have settled the West the way we did. You know, it's caused all kinds of problems between the U.S. and Mexico over the Rio Grande and all that. And they say, now we're just going to do exactly what you did. So it's a problem. Okay. A couple more. Oh, I'm running out of time. Okay. So, I guess I want to mention just one last thing before I move to solutions and problems, which we don't have too many solutions anyway, so that won't take too long. Which is that a food security problem. As the middle class emerges in China, they eat so-called up the food chain, and in order to create, say, a pound of beef, you have to use essentially 8 pounds of grain. So if everybody in China eats the amount of meat that we eat here, it may threaten global food supplies. There may not be enough food to go around. And again, you know, they're just saying we just want to do what you're doing. We like McDonald's now. It becomes fashionable to be able to eat a hamburger. In the olden days, you know, it was just a couple of shreds of meat at Spring Festival. And now everybody wants to, and they're getting fat. In the old days, everybody was slim, you know, everybody was healthy. Now they have, I think I read a statistic the other day that said 1 in 4 children in Beijing is obese, which is really amazing compared to the olden days. So when you eat up the food chain, you also are able to afford to eat some very endangered species. We get a cultural problem with traditional Chinese medicine, which places a great value on tiger bones, rhinoceros horns, deer antlers. And so in the olden days, when the Chinese couldn't afford this stuff, it was mostly a market in Japan and Korea and Taiwan. But now the Chinese can afford it too, and that is placing enormous pressure on, say, tigers in India, where a single tiger, by the time it reaches the end user, may be sold for $1 million, all the different parts. The original poacher may not make much money at all, but all those middle people will be making lots and lots of money. So if you're like me and you care about animals, then this is a great concern. Okay, so options and solutions. We should give a lot of credit to the Chinese government on the one hand. They participated in multinational negotiations. They're part of a lot of treaties. They went to Stockholm in '72. They went to Rio in '92. They actually have signed and ratified the Kyoto Protocol, which the United States has not done. Well, the Kyoto Protocol is called the Climate Change Protocol. Of course, they have signed and ratified it as a developing country, which means their obligations are somewhat limited, but they've still done a lot more than they need to do on the Kyoto Protocol. They've signed and ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity, which the United States has not done. So they've done really quite a lot. Their environmental laws are among the very best environmental laws in the world. They have an Agenda 21 office. Agenda 21 is a series of policy mechanisms that came out of the Rio meeting, and we don't have that in America. They talk about sustainable development as part of their 5-year plan. We don't talk about sustainable development in this country. So what's the problem here? The problem is that there's an enormous enforcement and implementation gap, and the local environmental policy officials are not empowered. There's tremendous corruption in the country as a whole, partly as a legacy of the Cultural Revolution and the disillusionment with the government that comes out of that. Now, again, everybody thinks that they can go around the law and get rich. Sometimes it's the local official who's supposed to be closing down that polluting factory who owns the polluting factory, so they close it down for a day, the EPA goes home, and they open it up again. So there's enormous problems with that. The other enormous problem is that social stability is a very, very important public good in China. So a lot of these old Rust Belt iron and steel plants in the Northeast should be shut down, but if you shut them down, the whole city would be out of work. And then you would have, the downfall of the Communist Party, which might be, a good thing, but we would prefer to not have it happen in a violent kind of a way, I think, most of us. So the Chinese government is caught, really, between some very difficult choices, the choice to give jobs and social stability versus the choice of trying to clean up and deal with another kind of social instability, namely all the anger around the pollution. So what can we do? Let's finish here so we can talk. I would say we can do not very much as foreigners. First thing we have to do is change our own behavior. However, we can work on technology transfer a lot more. We can be much more generous in terms of some of the intellectual property issues. There's something called the Clean Development Mechanism, which would allow us to invest in cleaning up in China and get credit under the Kyoto Protocol. Because if you take $10 and you put it into a fairly clean smokestack in the United States, you're not going to get as much of a change as if you take that $10 and put it into a very dirty smokestack in China. So overall, you're going to get an improvement in the climate change problem by investing in the developing world. That's the principle around the Clean Development Mechanism. So we can do that. We can work closely on the civil society level. The non-governmental sector in China is very vibrant on the environmental front. There's a sort of social space available for environmental issues that's not available for human rights and other things. So a lot of the NGOs are very active, from WWF to Greenpeace to the Nature Conservancy to Conservation International to Natural Resources Defense Council. They all have very active programs in China. So I think we have to sort of place our hope in these Chinese folks who really understand the problem and are looking for solutions. I'll stop there. Yes?
All right, questions?
There's one.
Comments?
Ma'am, besides NGOs going into China and trying to make a difference, is there any cooperation between the U.S. government and the Chinese government on this environmental issue?
Yes, good. Okay, the question is about the cooperation between the U.S. government and the Chinese government on environmental issues. Yes, the EPA has a very active program. They have a program called the Methane to Markets program, where they help to capture methane out of landfills and turn it into usable fuel. So I know that they are very active in China. The military actually has, it depends on the regime and power, I guess, but the military has done some joint exercises on disaster relief. The Chinese army is everywhere when there's a natural disaster. I mean, it's really amazing. I think, what do I know? But I think we should use our military much more actively for civilian things like post-Katrina kinds of things than we already do. So when there were those enormous floods in '98, the PLA was in there with sandbags rescuing people, and so we're doing some of that together with the Chinese military. Also in Central Asia, there are a number of joint kind of military cooperation. There's a theory of environmental peacemaking, which argues that quite often militaries can get together over environmental issues, and just like ping-pong diplomacy or something, that can be the wedge for making a lot of cooperation on a lot of issues. So I think there are some very smart people in the military. I was told I shouldn't mention the word army in here. But there is a fellow who comes to my class every year named Kent Butts, who teaches at the Army War College, and he's a very articulate proponent of environmental security initiatives within the U.S. military. So I don't know so much about what's going on the Navy level. I would say that as far as, it's a good question, because I sometimes think that our government is not doing as much as some of the European governments. When I've been in China and looked at some, say, green technology fairs, and people are showing their sewage plant things, it seems like it's all German companies and not so much American companies. So I think we should be doing a lot more. But it is, just one more thought, that some of these so-called brown plumes that they've started to detect are literally China's particulate air pollution is now being measured in California and in Washington State and in Western Canada. So this is not something that stays home. So their air pollution is our air pollution. You know, their water pollution is our water pollution. Their overfishing is our overfishing. So we have to work together on these issues. Another question? Yes.
And with the current global financial crisis, are you worried that China might suspend some environmental standards in order to maintain their economic growth?
Yeah, the question is about whether the global financial crisis is likely to, there was actually an article about this in the paper 2 days ago, I think, is likely to weaken China's attention to environmental issues because they have to focus on jobs and manufacturing. And there was precisely, I don't remember if it was in the New York Times or in the Washington Post, but it said, I might even have it in the fact. It said that, yes, China is starting to turn its attention away from environmental issues just because, just like for us, it starts to feel like a luxury. But in fact, it's not a luxury if you're looking at all long term. It's become something that you cannot afford not to do. And yet, with so many conflicting priorities and with plants shutting down, it starts to feel like something they can't afford. Yeah. There was another hand. Yes.
Ma'am, you said...
this man thing, is this like a Navy thing? Okay.
You said, you mentioned earlier these instances of environmental unrest. I believe there was 51,000. What are these instances?
Okay,
what do they
great question.
constitute? Can you give some examples?
Yeah, I mean, I'm stuck. The question is about this 51,000 examples of environmental disputes. The phrase they use is environmental mass incidents. Is the official phrase. Some of them are very big, and you read about them in the New York Times, like when they were opening up a very toxic kind of chemical plant in Xiamen, X-I-A-M-E-N. There was a massive outpouring of street protests, and people were using their cell phones to organize around it, and they actually were able to make that plant shut down and go somewhere else. I read just the other day that that exact plant is now opening somewhere else, so you get that displacement of environmental harms problem. But some of them might be very little. There's an odd thing that happens in China. Usually we think of environmental protests as being something that young people do. But in China, sometimes the retired people they take their little chair out and they block the road. I've actually run into one of these. They take their little chair out and they block the road. They have nothing to lose, and because the factory is spewing enormous black smoke out. So it could be something very small that would never even make it into the paper, but people know about it because there are these so-called environmental complaint lines where people can call up and complain, and they track those complaints. You have a massive, I don't know whether you call it environmental or not, but in Gansu province right now, there's a major riot going on because what happens most of all right now is that the government takes land from farmers or from residents and converts it over either for government buildings or for a golf course even, with an enormous level of corruption in the co-optation of land. And people feel very, very undercompensated and mistreated. You have all these poignant stories of, the single person who refused to move with an enormous construction pit all around them, and then finally they move this one diehard away. So I don't know whether those are counted as part of environmental mass incidents or not, but there's a lot of strife over land use and land transformation right now. So that's some examples. Yes?
How many issues do you think go on in China that might be unreported due to kind of government repression?
Yeah, how much stuff goes unreported in China? I had a role in this myself because way back when I was teaching in China from 1979 to 1980, and then I got married to a Chinese person whom I'm no longer married to. But when he and I were married, he became a democracy leader. In fact, Yumashua knows him well. And he ran for local representative of the National People's Congress. They tried to suppress his participation in the election because they only wanted people they chose. And then our school went on strike, and then the factories started to go on strike. And this was not getting reported. So I actually picked up the phone and called the New York Times. And it got into the New York Times and all that stuff. And I was very, very struck by the fact that so much is going on in China all the time. This is a country of a quarter of the people in the world, 1.3 billion people. Massive cities, so much is going on every second. And you're right, how much doesn't get reported? We would have to read, a New York Times this thick every day about China alone to be up on the news. So, and of course the public media, they're very tightly controlled. So often it's just chance, does a journalist happen to hear about it? Yes?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, what's your opinion on the Beijing Olympic and China's attempt to clean the mass scale cleanup before it? I'm wondering if it's viable or effective if the government attempt to do something similar in the future.
Yeah, great question. It was about the cleanup before the Olympics, and we had a lot of debate. People like me had a lot of debate over whether the cleanup of the Olympics was going to be long-term, whether it was going to essentially displace some of the harms from Beijing to some of the other areas in a kind of environmental injustice movement, whether how many of these improvements were going to be long-term. So, for example, I could say that the infrastructure improvements, like the new subways, are long-term and they're very good. But taking the cars off the road so that for 3 days or 5 days or 2 weeks we could have a little bit of a blue sky, and the Olympics and the athletes weren't all wearing face masks and stuff, that apparently the cars went right back on the road and the skies are just as bad as they ever were. So that's not a long-term kind of a solution. I had a little theory, which doesn't seem to be borne out so far, but I had this hope that once the people of Beijing saw the blue skies again, they wouldn't tolerate the grayness because they would remember what those blue skies look like. Because in Chinese they talk about wu, which means just haze or fog. They didn't even really understand. It had been so long since they'd seen blue skies that they didn't even understand that this was pollution to an extent. Or they'll say stuff like, you wouldn't be able to live here, the air is too bad, but we're used to it. So, because they have no choice, We can go there for 2 weeks and watch the Olympics and then go home again. They have no choice but to live in it. So how much is viable? How much is a long-term model? I think that the attention was very good, but here's another irony. That melamine poisoning thing. That was going, everybody knows about that? All the melamine in the milk with all the literally thousands of little children in the hospitals with kidney disease. That melamine poisoning thing was going on before the Beijing Olympics. But the authorities wanted to suppress it because they didn't want to embarrass China during the Olympics. So think of how many more babies ended up with kidney disease because of that effort to make a perfect Olympics. So there was a lot of human rights abuse before the Olympics, a lot of moving the unsavory people out, a lot of painting the grass green and moving people away from the rail lines so that all the foreign tourists could see a really perfect Olympics. In fact, there was even, there was a famous dancer. She had the only solo in the Olympics pre-show. Well, in the rehearsals, she apparently jumped off of something and became a paraplegic. It was awful. Beautiful, beautiful dancer. And they suppressed that. They wouldn't let it be publicized. Even one more stupid thing that they did. They had this little dance of, we're all united people, so they have, one Xinjiang person and one Thai person and one Korean person and one Tibetan person. They had 50 different little costumes. Well, it turned out that none of those people were actually minorities. Not a single one. They were all Han. Okay. Face is all about face. Okay. We have time for a few more, right? Yes, we do. We have a couple more. Yeah. Yes.
You said that, in China, there's a notion where they can sort of engineer their way out of economic disasters. Doesn't the Olympics, where they use their rockets to create rain and even moving the cars off the street to create a short-term solution, doesn't that just kind of prove to Chinese that they can, in fact, engineer their way out of engineering or out of environmental disasters when they need to?
Okay, great question. The question is whether the Chinese seem to think that they can engineer their way out of this problem of environmental degradation and resource shortage. And I would say that this argument is actually an argument that's happening on a global scale. Because to an extent, the notion that the slogan was "Man must conquer nature" during the Mao period, but to an extent, we've done that in America by, the Army Corps of Engineers used to talk about correcting the irrational course of rivers, straightening those rivers out. And, even post-Katrina, we're talking about putting the city back where it was, but building the dikes stronger and higher, rather than saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have New Orleans right there. So, by contrast, the Dutch are talking about adaptation to nature, and they're building different kinds of dikes that can actually open up in storm time, and giving some of those polders back to the sea, because they're seeing that they can no longer kind of fight against nature, but rather have to move in concert with nature. In China, the latest group of technocratic leaders has a very high percentage of engineers in it. It's interesting. At least they're educated. Okay, that's a good thing. But there's a very high number of people who think that you can make another massive construction project. So that is quite troubling. And in the opening of the Coffer Dam to the Three Gorges Dam, they made speeches that used all those Mao-era slogans. Man has conquered nature, the foolish old man has moved the mountain, and so on and so forth. And so those people who lived through the Cultural Revolution said they really got chills listening to that kind of speech. But I think it's not only the Chinese who have to look at themselves. I think a lot of us have to look at ourselves. Because even though we talk about technological optimists and Malthusian pessimists in the environmental world, and to this day we have this conversation in a lot of my classes where you get some kids who think, oh, well, we'll just invent something and it'll be all right. How many of you saw WALL-E? Yeah, so all of your professors saw WALL-E. WALL-E is a great environmental movie. And so in WALL-E, they actually go off and they live on another planet. It's like people think, oh, but it'll be okay, everything will be all right. Somebody will come up with something. And we all ignore the facts that, the population is going like this, the Arctic is going like that, the oceans are going like no fish. It's really, really bad. It's very, very serious. And yet we think, oh, it's going to be all right. Somebody will come up with something. Yes?
I wonder if we could look at it from a little different perspective, maybe from sort of a realpolitik U.S. perspective, that actually maybe environmental challenges in China could be a good thing, that it could sort of limit China's power vis-a-vis the United States, or possibly be the vehicle for political change that we haven't seen. What's your reaction to that from sort of a national security policy? Well, this could really sort of bring down the dragon in some ways.
Right. Okay, the question is the realpolitik kind of question, like, is it kind of good for us that China has all these environmental problems because it will limit China's growth and strength, or is it possible that the environmental problems may cause some kind of pressure for political change? I would say that China thinks that we think that, the first thing.
Right, sure.
In fact, so when somebody like me goes to China and says, I'm really worried, I want to help you with your environmental problems, and we don't want you to develop the way we did, they'll say, you guys are part of a containment conspiracy and you don't want us to be strong. You want us to have these environmental problems. So, I would say, as an environmentalist, I say China's environmental problems are not only bad for China, they are bad for the world, and I already sort of said what I think about that and why. But as far as the democracy argument, I think there is something there. And that's one reason that the Chinese government has been controlling the environmental NGOs pretty tightly. If you are an environmental NGO, you have to register with a government agency, which they call your mother-in-law. The government agency has to take responsibility for your behavior. So naturally, no government agency really wants to be anybody's mother-in-law. So it becomes safe to plant trees, pick up garbage, have early childhood education nature programs, save the Tibetan antelope, but much less safe to, have us sit down in the middle of the street, hang a banner from something, sue the EPA, sue, the corrupt Communist Party boss who's running the polluting factory, those kinds of things. But the Chinese environmental NGOs have to be very, very careful or they'll get shut down. And some of them have not been able to register. And so they're acting as businesses, but they could get kicked out of the country any time. So yeah, I think that there is a real question whether this kind of civil society can put more pressure on the government to democratize. So that would be a good thing. Because my argument would be that we can't really have environmental protection unless we have real freedom of information, unless people can find out transparently how bad is that water, how many people are dying on natural deaths of air pollution every year, you know, what's in that smokestack, you know, and then you get a whole kind of a dialogue and public pressure that forces that kind of change. One more?
We have time for a couple.
A couple more. Well,
More than a couple.
more than a couple more. All right, well, what do we have? I don't know, one of the professors.
Well, I was thinking, you know, in Japan, there's this sort of unreal attention to recycling. And if you spend time in Japan, you take out your garbage, you literally, there are people that will check your garbage and make sure that it's all plastic, all glass, all vegetable matter, whatever. What about in China? What is the relationship between the environment and ordinary people?
Okay, so the question is Japan, and I think there's, in Kyoto, where I just was, there are 24 different categories of trash that you have to separate. And if you don't do it right, then everybody will get very upset with you.
They come and get you.
They come and get you. Yeah, in fact, I read an interesting article. You know, the Japanese are very worried about the drop in their overall population, and there's a whole pro-natalist camp that wants women to have babies, and women don't want to have babies. And so they finally, you know, they're very into racial purity in Japan, and so they finally let some Brazilian Japanese come in. And those Brazilian Japanese were not recycling properly. They got really upset. So the relationship of ordinary people. There is a tendency to think that it's the government's problem, it's not my problem. And that comes partly from that whole disillusionment with the government that comes from the Cultural Revolution. The government used to say, you know, serve the people, sacrifice yourself, give away the big apple, take the wormy apple for yourself. And the people realized that they did all that stuff and they got sold, you know, they suffered greatly for listening to the government. So now they don't want to listen to the government anymore. So if the government says, you know, pick up your trash, recycle, they've had too many slogans, you know, they don't care about that stuff anymore. So when I go there to China, I say, well, I organize a cleanup every year in my neighborhood, and I don't expect the government to do that. But that's kind of a new way of thinking, and to an extent the university students are doing this kind of thing, but it's not common. So it's very tragic, like a famous city like Suzhou, which is famous for its old canals. Those canals are clogged fully with trash. It's just disgusting. Tragic. So the relationship of the people and the environment. One thing the government has done that's really good is they ban plastic bags completely. But that's a good thing. But I don't think, there's another thing you notice when you visit an ordinary Chinese home, you go up into the, like an apartment building, and the public spaces tend to be really trashed. They tend to be dirty. They tend to be, the walls are filthy. And then you knock on the door of the apartment and you go inside and everything's gorgeous. So there is a little bit of a lack, I would say, of attention to the public good. It's very different from what you have in Japan. Yeah, Japan, you don't find a drop of anything anywhere. It's really, maybe a little obsessive. Okay, another question. Yes?
I wondered, you mentioned NGOs in China. Is there a kind of Rachel Carson's figure at all? Is there a leader of an environmental movement? And if so, how is this figure treated by the government, or how is this figure regarded by the common people?
Yeah. Okay, the question is about the environmental leaders. There's a very famous man, this is actually an interesting story, at least to us China people, the guy named Liang Congjie, Liang Congjie, for those of you who are taking notes. And he founded the first environmental NGO in China called Friends of Nature. And he was able to do that because he has an amazing lineage. He's actually the grandson of Liang Qichao, who was one of the two democratic leaders of the 100 Days Reform in 1898, if I have my days right. His son, Liang Congjie's father, is a very famous architect named Liang Sicheng, And he was persecuted to death during the Cultural Revolution for trying to get the Red Guards to preserve some of the old traditional architecture. And so he's very revered now as somebody who should never have been persecuted to death. It was a bad idea to persecute him to death. And so because Sun Chia's lineage is so distinguished, nobody dares touch him. So he formed this NGO way back in around mid-80s, I think. And it's a membership NGO, so it's very different. Like, I might be a member of the Nature Conservancy or NRDC. I write my check, $30, and get the magazine, and I don't do anything. But but the Chinese NGO membership wants to do something, so they actually have to apply to be a member and talk about what it is that they would like to do, and then they actually go out and do these trash pickups and tree plantings and all of this. And they have membership, a very, very large membership base. But Liang is quite old now and he's not so well. So he's trying to pass things on to a younger generation. There's also a very senior person who's known as the father of Chinese environmentalism, and his name is escaping me for a moment. He writes on population and the environment. It's Qi. It'll come to me maybe. So he's written a book that articulates the relationship between overpopulation and China's environmental problems. But he's also, he may even be dead. Then you got these sort of heroes like Wang Canfa, who he has a center for the victims of pollution, a legal center for assistance to the victims of pollution. And he's doing really innovative things, suing. When I just said before that they don't sue. Well, he sues. And yet, he's kind of, the thing to do if you're an NGO is to get as famous as you can before they take you away. So, we were talking earlier about somebody we both know who's in jail for life. He didn't get famous enough before they took him away. So. But I think there's also amazing young people, just brilliant young people who, there's a famous nature photographer who could have had a brilliant career doing something else, and instead he lived in this area where these famous, the Jinsuho, the golden monkey, lives to document the illegal loggers coming in and take pictures of those. So, a lot of really great heroism. Yes?
So how would you say that a comparative between United States youth and Chinese youth on how they view the environment? Because I remember in high school, a lot of kids would just drop things on the floor and say, well, someone will pick it up. And so things are relatively clean here because we pay people to pick up everyone else's trash. And so in China, are people the same? Are the kids the same way, or do they think, well, maybe we should pick this up and throw it away?
Okay, that's a great question. The question is about the difference between attitudes towards the environment in the U.S. and in China, particularly among kids, I guess. And when I first did my book, I was interviewing old people because I was writing about a historic period. And then when the book was in galleys, the State Department asked me to go to China and talk to young people. That's one of they have a speaker program. And I had to change the whole conclusion of my book, because I discovered that the young people of China were really extremely well informed about environmental issues at the college level. Highly educated young people, probably more informed about environmental issues than your average American college student. Partly because the problem is so severe. You really see that filthy, filthy smoke and that terrible, terrible water and those piles and piles of garbage. And so, it's really in your face. Whereas in the United States, you could think, our problems are not so bad. A lot of it's invisible. But this public-mindedness, I think both countries have to work on this. Because as you were saying, some kids in America will think, I'll throw it on the ground, somebody will pick it up. And, who do you think is going to pick that up? That's why some of these experimental schools where they don't have any maintenance workers are really great, I think. My sister went to a school like that called Putney in Vermont, where it was a working farm, and they actually didn't have any hired workers. The kids did everything to make that place run. And that's a really great education. So you stop thinking, oh, somebody else will do it, somebody will pick it up. I think my time is over.
Well, I think, man. This is a great lecture, and I think we added one more important dimension to our China awareness here, and not just about realpolitik, which is very important. You can also see this aspect, this dimension of China's environmental development or lack of development is also interlinked with many other strategic issues that we are really talking about here on a daily basis. And I'd like to thank you very much, and hopefully we'll get her back to talk more some other time. And once again, thank you.